Okay, let's unpack one of the most, I think, stunning paradoxes in modern political history.
It really is something.
You have a president running for re-election on a platform of peace, and he has this incredibly successful, definitive slogan, right?
He kept us out of war. It was everywhere.
Exactly. That was Woodrow Wilson, and this leads to his second inauguration in March of 1917.
And yet, what, barely 4 weeks later?
Just a month.
The very same man is standing for a joint session of Congress, and he's requesting a declaration of war. A declaration that would just, irrevocably drag the United States across the Atlantic.
And completely changed the course of the 20th century.
Completely.
That is the seismic shift we are diving into today. The entry of the United States into World War I, it wasn't some inevitable march toward destiny.
No, not at all.
It was, as our sources really define it, a messy, agonizing 3-year saga.
Right, a period where American neutrality just frayed under all this pressure from global economics, diplomatic clashes, genuine moral outrage.
And what we'll get into, a piece of truly audacious spycraft that just completely destabilized the whole political landscape.
And to really understand the trauma of that shift, you have to appreciate where the U.S. began in 1914. Europe was just, exploding into war, but America was firmly rooted in isolationism.
We were a growing industrial power for sure, but we were really content to just focus on our own hemisphere. Militarily, though, we were a complete non-factor.
It's almost comical. We were this developing industrial giant with an army that was, smaller than Portugal's?
Smaller than Portugal's. The nation had absolutely zero desire to get entangled in what they saw as Europe's old, complicated feuds.
Which is exactly why Wilson, who was this sort of scholarly, slightly aloof idealist,
Right.
he moved immediately to formalize this position.
Yeah.
In August 1914, he issues an official declaration of neutrality.
And he famously urges Americans to be not just impartial in action, but impartial in thought as well.
I mean, he really wanted America to rise above the whole conflict, to maintain its moral purity.
But this wasn't just Wilson's personal high-minded philosophy at work, was it? We learn from the sources that this neutrality was really a matter of domestic necessity.
The huge necessity. The U.S. at the time is described as a demographic powder keg.
So what does that mean in, practical terms?
It means that if Wilson had sided with one faction right away, he risked tearing the country apart from the inside.
Wow.
I mean, you need to remember that of the 92 million people in the U.S., and roughly a third of them were either foreign-born or had foreign-born parents.
So you have these intense, conflicting loyalties.
Exactly. You had millions of German Americans whose loyalty to their ancestral homeland was really, really strong. They saw the Kaiser's government not as autocratic, but as a defender of culture against, say, Russian encroachment.
And at the same time, you've got Irish Americans.
A huge and very vocal group. And their one and only goal was to see the downfall of the British Empire. They would actively sabotage any efforts to ally with London.
But then on the other side of that coin, you have the established old-stock American elite, especially on the East Coast.
And they felt an intense kinship with Britain and France.
Yeah.
Shared language, shared literature, a deep appreciation for the democratic ideals they saw in those nations.
So yeah, if Wilson had picked a side, he would have instantly alienated these massive, powerful voting blocs.
He could have even provoked civil unrest. So that really explains why neutrality was absolutely necessary just to keep the peace at home.
But here's the challenge that neutrality immediately ran into.
Money.
Money.
That's the critical pivot, right? The diplomatic ideal was impartial in thought, but the economic reality was profoundly biased.
America was open for business.
And business very quickly became a one-way street, straight to the Allies.
And what an immediate reversal that was for the economy. The sources indicate the U.S. was actually teetering on the edge of a serious recession right before the war started.
It was. But the moment Europe began consuming munitions, uniforms, food, all of it.
That recession just evaporated.
Yeah.
The economic bonanza was immense.
And this is where the British Royal Navy becomes a kind of silent partner in the American economy.
How so?
Britain established this crushing, really effective surface blockade of Germany. So this meant that any American shipping trying to reach continental Europe was forced to stop in British ports.
And if the cargo was declared contraband, which could be almost anything.
Right, anything potentially useful to the German war effort, it was seized.
Which means all that massive American production, from cotton to copper to canned goods, it could only consistently and safely be shipped to Britain and France.
So our official neutrality pretty quickly morphed into a situation where, 90% or more of American trade was flowing directly to the Allied side.
American farmers were feeding Allied soldiers.
American factories like Bethlehem Steel and the chemical giant DuPont were signing contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars to supply Allied munitions. The financial entanglement was just staggering.
Staggering is absolutely the right word. Early in the war, American banks were pretty hesitant to loan large sums to the belligerents, but that policy changed.
When J.P. Morgan and Co. stepped in.
Right, they became the primary purchasing agent for the British and French governments.
And Morgan just led the charge in securing massive credit for the Allies. By 1917, American financial institutions had loaned Britain and France something like $2.3 billion.
And you have to put that number in context. For the listener, that was an astronomical sum. It represented a huge percentage of the entire U.S. national budget at the time.
A massive amount of money.
That's why, by 1916, American prosperity was now just inextricably tied to an Allied victory.
Of course. If Britain and France collapsed, they would default on those multi-billion-dollar loans.
And the American economy, which had been pulled out of a recession by these war orders, would be dragged right into a depression by an Allied defeat.
And Germany saw this perfectly clearly. They didn't see the U.S. as neutral. They saw America as the Allied power's silent, wealthy partner.
Funding and arming their enemies from across the ocean.
So the challenge for Germany then became, well, how do you cut that lifeline without suffering unacceptable consequences?
This inherent conflict, then, this ideal of diplomatic neutrality versus the reality of, economic belligerence, that was the precise backdrop when a terrifying new piece of technology entered the scene.
The German undersea boot.
The U-boat.
Germany recognized that they could never, ever match the massive surface fleet of the British Royal Navy.
Any chance.
So their only effective counter-blockade weapon was the submarine. But the U-boat immediately created this moral and legal dilemma.
Because it just couldn't adhere to the traditional cruiser rules of naval warfare.
It couldn't.
So let's talk about those rules because they're so crucial to understanding the American outrage that followed.
Okay, so cruiser rules required any warship to hail a merchant vessel, check its papers and cargo, and most importantly,
let the crew and passengers get off safely.
Exactly. Allow them to safely abandon ship before you sink it. A U-boat couldn't do any of that.
Why not?
Well, for a few very practical reasons. A U-boat was small and extremely fragile. If it surfaced to follow those rules, to conduct a long inspection or launch lifeboats, it became a sitting duck.
A really easy target. Merchant vessels had started arming themselves.
Right, so a surfaced U-boat risked being blown out of the water. Plus, it just wasn't designed for search and rescue. It had limited provisions, limited air. It was designed to do one thing.
Fire a torpedo and vanish.
Exactly. So they attacked without warning. And to Americans, that wasn't an act of war. That was an act of piracy. It was striking civilians without any provocation.
And this tension just explodes into a full-blown crisis on May 7, 1915.
The sinking of the RMS Lusitania.
This was the luxurious British ocean liner torpedoed off the coast of Ireland. It sank with terrifying speed.
Just 18 minutes.
18 minutes. It was carrying wealthy socialites, families, business people.
And, to be fair, a significant amount of war contraband in its hold.
Right. But the human cost was just devastating.
1,198 people drowned.
Including 128 American citizens.
And the American public was enraged. You had politicians, most notably former President Teddy Roosevelt, just demanding immediate war. He called it murder on the high seas.
But Wilson, surprisingly, holds firm to his restraint. He has that famous line that a nation could be too proud to fight.
He still understood that domestic divisiveness too well, didn't he? He wasn't going to rush into war over the sinking of a British ship, even when carrying Americans.
So instead, he just hammers Germany with a series of sharp diplomatic notes, demanding they end this unrestricted warfare against passenger liners.
And amazingly, his diplomacy worked, for a time. Germany, fearing the U.S. entry, and at this point they still thought they could win without it, they issued the Sussex Pledge in May 1916.
And that was a promise to stop sinking non-military ships without warning.
Yep, that pledge diffused the crisis, it saved lives, and it allowed Wilson to successfully campaign on the platform that he had kept the peace.
That diplomatic victory was the absolute centerpiece of his re-election campaign.
But that success was built on a foundation of sand, really. By late 1916, the war in Europe had bogged down into this bloody, impossible stalemate.
And Germany was suffering terribly from the British blockade. They were running out of food, raw materials.
And ultimately hope.
Mhm.
They needed a knockout blow.
And this is where we get to Germany's catastrophic gamble. They realized they had to sever that Allied lifeline right now, regardless of the consequences.
So on January 31st, 1917, they announced the immediate and unconditional resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare.
They knew this move would likely pull the U.S. into the war.
They did, but their calculation was ruthless and, well, pragmatic from their point of view. They believed the U.S. was so fundamentally unprepared for war
Right.
that they could starve Britain into submission within 6 months long, before the unprepared Americans could mobilize, train, and actually deploy an effective fighting force across the Atlantic.
But Germany wasn't content just sinking ships. They needed a contingency plan, didn't they, to make sure America stayed busy and distracted on its own continent.
And that brings us to the just astonishing piece of spycraft that sealed their fate.
The Zimmermann telegram.
The Zimmermann telegram. In late February 1917, British naval intelligence intercepts and successfully decodes a secret message.
Sent by the German foreign minister, Arthur Zimmermann, to the German minister in Mexico City.
And the content was, truly a bombshell. It proposed a military alliance between Germany and Mexico if the U.S. entered the war.
And here's the truly audacious part, the bribe. Germany promised Mexico generous financial support and help in reconquering its lost territory.
In Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona.
Can you imagine?
The British, who had kept their code-breaking abilities a total secret, they immediately released the decoded telegram to the Americans.
And Wilson, reading this, now had undeniable proof of German hostility, but what truly mattered was the public reaction.
Oh, absolutely. A U-boat sinking a vessel in the cold Atlantic was, it's abstract to a farmer in Nebraska or a rancher in Arizona.
But a plot to invade Texas?
That was an immediate, palpable threat to the American homeland. You can imagine the newspaper headlines.
The reaction was electric and unifying. One Texas paper reportedly dedicated its entire front page to just 2 words.
War imminent.
War imminent. It sounded so outlandish at first that a lot of Americans thought it was a clever British forgery.
A trick to manipulate the U.S. into the war.
And then Arthur Zimmermann himself,
In a truly baffling move.
publicly admitted to the press that he had, in fact, sent the telegram.
That admission acted like a chemical catalyst. It completely unified the country. It bridged that divide between the anti-war, isolationist heartland and the pro-war, economically entangled East Coast.
Germany, in one telegram, had managed to alienate every single corner of the United States, all at once.
And with that final psychological and political barrier broken, the momentum was unstoppable.
Throughout March of 1917, German U-boats made good on their threat, sinking several unarmed American merchant ships and just finally exhausting Wilson's monumental patience.
So on the rainy evening of April 2nd, 1917, Wilson comes before Congress. But he doesn't ask for revenge. He doesn't demand compensation for the loans. He reframes the entire conflict.
He lifts it to a higher moral plane. This is where the enduring template for American foreign policy was really forged, isn't it?
It is. Wilson argued that this conflict was not about territory or national interest, but about a necessary moral crusade against autocratic regimes.
And he delivered the legacy quote that would define the next century of American power. He declared that America must fight because
The world must be made safe for democracy.
the world must be made safe for democracy. He was arguing America had a duty to defend liberty and peace for all nations, not just for itself.
A radical idea at the time.
The formal declaration of war came 4 days later, on April 6, 1917. But what's often forgotten in the rush of history is that the vote was not unanimous.
Not at all. In the House, 50 representatives voted no, which underscores the deep skepticism about intervention that still persisted.
Among them was Jeanette Rankin of Montana.
The very first woman ever elected to Congress.
And her voice of dissent was so powerful and famous. She said, "I want to stand by my country, but I cannot vote for war."
And that dissent just highlights the ultimate irony of this awakening giant,
America was stepping onto the world stage as the defender of democracy, but it was entirely unprepared for a modern war.
The U.S. Army, as we said at the start, was the 17th largest in the world. It lacked tanks. It lacked modern planes. It certainly lacked the hundreds of thousands of trained men needed for trench warfare.
The first major U.S. troops wouldn't even arrive in France for over a year.
America had committed to war, but now it had to build an army and a navy capable of fighting it from scratch under immense pressure.
So What does this deep dive mean for us, the listener, today? Why is April 6, 1917, arguably the most important turning point in modern American history?
Well, before this date, the U.S. was a regional power. It was dedicated to that old advice from George Washington, avoiding entangling alliances. April 6, 1917, was, effectively, the birth certificate of the American century. It was the moment the U.S. permanently stepped out of its hemisphere and accepted the role of a global superpower.
And the self-appointed defender of international order.
Exactly. And that template of Wilsonian idealism, this belief that America's military strength should be used to spread democracy and human rights, not just for territorial gain.
That philosophy is what defined our entry into World War II. It structured the entire global conflict of the Cold War. It fundamentally changed the DNA of the nation forever.
And here's the final provocative thought for you to mull over. We talked about Wilson going from being too proud to fight for national self-interest to fighting for this moral imperative, right?
Making the world safe for democracy.
Was that a genuine philosophical shift? Or was it simply clever branding, necessary to justify a war that had become, well, economically unavoidable?
And regardless of the motivation, you have to consider the unintended consequences. The way the war ended, followed by the U.S.'s rapid retreat back into strict isolationism in the 1920s.
That hesitation, that choice to step in and then immediately step back from the League of Nations.
It arguably sowed the seeds for the even greater catastrophe of World War II just 2 decades later. The nation's decision to embrace global power came with a staggering price tag, both immediate and, as it turned out, delayed.